Section 19 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 15, The Great War, Part 2. The following afternoon, the program was one of real symphonic proportions and included Saint-Saëns' Great Symphony No. 3 for orchestra, organ, and piano, Debussy's L'après-midi d'une faune, and the symphonic variations for piano with orchestra by César Franck. The organ part in the symphony was played by Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger, without doubt the greatest woman musician I have ever known, and the Franck variations were superbly interpreted by Alfred Cortot. Monsieur Casadisou played an exquisite concerto for the viola d'amour by Lorenzetti. The little Salle du Conservatoire, its quaint architecture dating from the time of Louis XVI, with its tiny boxes and balconies, was jammed to the doors. The janitor told me that it was the largest audience he had ever seen there. Every available space was filled twice over, and the walls literally bulged outward. The audience was a very interesting one. The French government, with its usual politeness, had sent official representatives from the Ministère des Étrangers, the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, and the French High Commission, many of them in uniform. There were also many French musicians of distinction, among them dear Maître Charles Widor, the Secrétaire Perpétuel de l'Institut de France, and of course many French, British, and American soldiers. A New York fire commissioner would have gasped at the way in which all precautions were disregarded, and the excitement in the audience when at the end of the concert we played the Marseillaise and the Star-Spangled Banner can be imagined. To add to my pleasure, my daughter Alice, who was doing war work away down in Brest, had received permission to come up to Paris for the great occasion. My old friend Paul Cravath, vice president of the New York Symphony Society, who was at that time at the head of our finance commission in London, had flown over in an English airplane and smiled upon me from a center box in all his splendor of 6'4" as I turned around to make my bow to the cheering audience. I think we gave them an exceedingly good concert. The orchestra were delightful in their keen desire to carry out my intentions, but I think if we had played less well, the enthusiasm would have been just as great, for while we were playing, the names of Seicheprey and Chateau-Thierry were vibrating in the hearts of all listeners, and their enthusiasm was poured out upon me as if I, single-handed, demonstrated the valor of our American troops. At the end of the concert, the president of the Musical Orchestral Union of Paris presented me with a large bouquet of roses tied with the American colors, and in a very eloquent speech voiced the gratitude of the French musicians for the assistance which had been given them by our Society of American Friends of Musicians in France. I was able to supplement my words of thanks with a further substantial check, which had been sent by Mr. Flagler, and which was to be devoted to the families of orchestral musicians serving at the front. The week had been fully occupied with the preparations for these two concerts, but notwithstanding the attendant excitements and elations, I had periods of great despondency. The possibility of continuing my mission in France seemed less and less capable of fulfillment, partly owing to the tense military situation, and partly because I did not seem to get the proper assistance from the YMCA. Mr. McLean and Mr. Sloan, at the head of affairs in New York, had given me their enthusiastic support, and I had sailed at their urgent request. They had cabled and written full instructions to the Y in France, and on my arrival Mr. Ernest Carter, the head worker, whom I liked exceedingly, had promised me the fullest cooperation, but he was evidently harassed and overworked, and did not get the efficient help which he should have had in the running of so large an organization in wartime. Many of the heads of departments were ex-clergymen or church and Sunday school workers who were evidently inexperienced in the management of practical affairs. I am told that later on this condition was much improved, and that the men who were subsequently sent out from America were chosen more for their business ability, but at the time I mention, the confusion at the headquarters in the Rue d'Aguesseau was often great, and there seemed to be insufficient cooperation between the different departments. In order to be able to travel around France unmolested, I had to have a carte rouge, and this card it seemed impossible to obtain for me, notwithstanding all my proper and complete credentials as an American, as a musician well known all over our country, and above all, as a persona grata with the French government. A few days before my first concert, I was informed that it was impossible to procure this card for me, and that therefore I could not be permitted to leave Paris. When I asked for an explanation, it was refused by a rather sanctimonious person, who put his arm around me, called me brother, but expressed his regret at the unfortunate fact of my having been born in Germany. I swallowed my rage as best I could, but my chagrin was all the greater because in the meantime Monsieur Casadisou and 4 other distinguished French artists had offered me their services to travel around with me in a motor car and give concerts in our camps and hospitals. I finally obtained the information from a very nice young man who was in charge of the entertainment division of the Y that he understood that the objections came from the intelligence department of the AEF. I immediately called on Major Cabot Ward, the head of the intelligence division in Paris, whom I had known in New York for 25 years. I showed him my various credentials, and he assured me that, as far as the United States Army is concerned, you are as free as air. I returned with this information to the Rue d'Aguesseau, and was met by the same impenetrable wall of ignorance or ill will, and as my friends at the French High Commission had already assured me that as far as they were concerned all France was open to me, I seemed to be at my wits' end how to unravel this riddle. I finally called on my friend Robert Bliss, counselor of our embassy in Paris. I can never forget his kindness and helpfulness during this period. He and his charming wife had made their apartment the very center of American life during those trying times. Mrs. Bliss had resolutely refused to leave Paris, and dispensed a generous hospitality at their apartment in the Rue Henri Moisson. When I told him of my troubles, and that I, who had lived in America 47 years, should now be thus treated, he smiled and said, "We can do nothing for you at present, as you are still a part of the organization of the YMCA, but as soon as you get that uniform off, you will find every road open to you." That wretched uniform! It had annoyed me from the first moment I had put it on, because the tailor to whom the Y had sent me had made a miserable job of it. It was too narrow between the shoulders, which is fatal for an orchestral conductor, and the trousers were a tragedy. But there was no time before sailing to order a better fitting uniform, and as I had been told that I could not move an inch in France without it, I had literally taken no civilian clothes with me. I had ordered some new clothes in Paris, but there was a tailor's strike on, and I was therefore, for decency's sake, compelled to hold on to that uniform, much as I longed to divest myself of the symbol of the sacred triangle. However, I began to see daylight, and as I hoped by the following Monday or Tuesday to get my new civilian clothes, I decided to conduct the 2 concerts on Saturday and Sunday, and then magnificently hand in my resignation. But I was not spared a last drop of bitterness, for on Saturday morning I received a visit from a very stupid and exasperating officier de liaison of the YMCA, who proceeded to inform me that as I had been born in Germany and therefore could not obtain my carte rouge, the committee of the Y thought that I should not conduct the 2 concerts in their uniform. Again that accursed uniform! I was so enraged that I said I would either conduct in it or in my underclothes, that my resignation had already been written and would be presented on Monday, and that I insisted on an interview with Mr. Carter and his executive committee, as I wished them to know how I had been treated. I knew that Mr. Carter, poor man, had no knowledge of the entire affair, as he had been zigzagging around France all this time to the various posts and supply centers of the Y, trying to bring some kind of order out of chaos. He immediately accorded me a meeting, and when I told my story, made me an apology so ample and generous that I left him with none but the kindliest feelings, and really regretted that he, a man of high ideals and spiritual power, should through the exigencies of war have been so overburdened with practical affairs. For a few of his aides I have nothing but absolute contempt, but there were many among the men workers, and certainly the majority of the women, who gave wonderful service, and gladly suffered all kinds of annoyances and deprivations in order to help the soldiers, who were not all angels by any means. But my real triumph was to come on the very Sunday morning of my concert, when General Charles Dawes of the American Army called on me at my hotel, and to my amazement asked me whether I could come to the general headquarters of the AEF at Chaumont and confer with General Pershing regarding the possible improvement of our army bands. I could not believe my ears that so suddenly after my bitter experiences with the Y, the Commander-in-Chief of the American Army in France had personally sent for me. General Dawes was at that time at the head of the Army Supplies, with headquarters in Paris. A great lover of music, he had contributed largely to its cultivation in his own city of Chicago. He was an old and valued friend of General Pershing, and I think that it was he who had suggested my name to him. I can never thank General Dawes enough for giving me, a musician and over 50 years of age, this wonderful opportunity to touch even the outer hem of the robes of the war goddess. Needless to say, my despondent mood immediately changed to one of elation. I accepted the invitation with alacrity and arranged with General Dawes to go to Chaumont on the following Wednesday, July 17. In the meantime, the air had been full of rumors regarding the Big Bertha, who had been conveniently silent ever since my arrival in Paris. It was persistently said that on Monday morning 17 of these ladies, bearing the same name, would again begin a bombardment of Paris, and I confess that it gave me something of a shock when, on the Monday morning after my concert, while I was still luxuriating in bed, thinking with pleasure of the triumphs of the day before, and with eager anticipation of my approaching trip to Chaumont, I suddenly heard a curious reverberation different from the explosions of the Gothas or of the answering air guns. It was the first greeting of Madame Bertha, and this greeting was repeated punctiliously every 15 minutes throughout the day, the shells striking in Paris in different quarters. It was interesting to watch the French people. After every shot, crowds of them would run into the streets, talking, gesticulating, and speculating where that particular shell had fallen. This would go on for 13 or 14 minutes, and then all would scoot back into their shops and houses as they knew that the next shell was about due. That evening I had been invited to dine at Mrs. Edith Wharton's at her lovely apartment in the Rue de Varennes. Just as I got to her door, a Frenchman stopped and said to me that he had been at the concert on the preceding day. He then added, "I see that you are making the acquaintance of La Grosse Bertha." Thinking that he referred to the return of the bombardment, I smiled assent, and then proceeded to Mrs. Wharton's apartment. I found our great novelist with 2 other ladies, an American officer and an American composer, my dear friend Blair Fairchild, who had been living in Paris for several years and was acting most ably as distributing agent for the money which our Society of American Friends of Musicians in France was sending over. The dinner proceeded as if we lived in times of deepest peace. It was served with punctilious efficiency. The flowers were charming and the conversation delightful, and it was only when dinner was half over that I found out, quite casually, that what my French gentleman at the door had referred to was that only 2 minutes before my arrival the last shell of the Big Bertha had fallen on the roof of the house opposite, demolishing it and parts of the upper story. On the following Wednesday, July 17, I took the morning train for Chaumont, again comfortably clad in civilian clothes. I was met at the station by a young officer, Lieutenant Wendell, nephew of my old friend Evart Wendell, who took me to General Headquarters and introduced me to Lieutenant Colonel Collins, Secretary of the General Staff, who explained to me in detail various points on which General Pershing desired information and assistance. I was then most comfortably put up at the guest house, formerly a large private residence in the town, which had been taken over by General Pershing to accommodate his visitors. I was to dine at his chateau that evening, and spent a great part of the afternoon walking through the quaint old hill town, situated on a high cliff overlooking the valley of the Marne. It was during this walk that I saw the only drunken American private during my 3 months' stay in France. I was following a picturesque road leading out of the town into the country, when a colored boy in khaki reeled toward me and said, "Excuse me, sah, are you a Frenchman?" I said no, and he replied, "Then for God's sake, will you please tell me where I can get a drink?" I answered, "No, you have evidently had enough already." He tried to follow me, and I, seeing 2 white soldiers approaching, turned to them and said, "I think you had better take care of this boy. He has had too much to drink." They briskly answered, "Certainly, sir," but as they went up to him, he kept peering at me and said, "I want to talk to that gentleman. That's Mr. Damrosch." I laughed out loud, for here I was, over 3,000 miles from home, and this boy, who perhaps had musical inclinations and had heard me conduct in some concert, recognized me even through the alcoholic vapors which surrounded him so thickly that one could have cut them with a knife. One of the other visitors at the guest house was General Omar Bundy, who commanded the 1st Division and had come to Chaumont to receive the congratulations of the Commander-in-Chief on the splendid work of his division. He proved a delightful gentleman, and we chatted together very amicably as a motor car took us that evening about 5 miles beyond Chaumont, through most lovely country to the chateau surrounded by exquisite gardens and woods, which General Pershing had taken for his personal residence. A scene of greater peace and tranquility could not be imagined, and literally the only sign and symbol of war was the solitary sentry pacing up and down before the entrance with bayonet fixed. As this happened to be the first day of General Foch's great attack, in which he pushed the Germans back 6 miles, General Pershing, who had been at the front all day, had not yet returned, and General Bundy and I walked through the grounds in the lovely evening twilight for perhaps half an hour, when a motor car drove up, and our great Commander-in-Chief, accompanied by his aide, immediately came over to us and made us welcome in hearty and simple fashion. He reminded me that we had met at the Presidio in San Francisco during the Great Exhibition of 1915, and indeed I remembered it well, for shortly afterward he had been sent to the Mexican border in command of the troops, and while there had been overwhelmed by the terrible tragedy of the death of his wife and children, who were suffocated in a fire at night which destroyed their home at the Presidio. So much has been written regarding the wonderful impression which General Pershing made in Europe on all who came in contact with him that it is not necessary for me to more than echo the general chorus of praise. Soldierly, dignified, courteous, and simple in his bearing, wearing a uniform as only a man can who has been a soldier all his life. We entered the house and shortly after sat down to dinner. The party consisted of the Commander-in-Chief, General Bundy, and a most delightful staff of 8 officers, I being the only civilian. As such, I expected and half hoped that the talk would be all about the wonderful success of the first day's push by Foch, of which I had already heard enthusiastic rumors in the town, or of great military secrets, affairs of strategy, monster guns, thousands of airplanes, and new, mysterious machines of destruction. But, to my surprise, the conversation during almost the entire dinner was of music, of its influence in raising the spirits of the soldier, in giving him the right kind of recreation, and the necessary relief from the monotony of camp work or the horrors of battle. General Pershing told me that after hearing some of the crack military bands of France and England, he had been so overwhelmed by the consciousness of our inferiority that he was eager to know if something could not be done to improve the general standard of our army bands, and, more particularly, whether it might not be possible, at least, to take out the best players from among the bands then in France, and to form a headquarters band of superior excellence, led by the best bandmaster among them, and in this way form a model which the others could endeavor to copy. This suggestion seemed to me excellent, and I asked how many bandmasters there were at present in France, as I would like to examine them as to their fitness. General Pershing said, with a smile, that there were over 200, but this did not faze me, and I agreed to examine them all, provided that proper arrangements could be made for a fitting test of their qualifications. Various plans for such an examination were discussed, and General Pershing finally decided to send them all to Paris in batches of 50 every week, together with a military band, which should be stationed there for the following 4 or 5 weeks, thus giving me abundant opportunity to test their efficiency in conducting as well as in harmony and orchestration. It seemed to me at the time remarkable that, in the midst of war, and with all its many immediate necessities weighing upon him, General Pershing should have had the acumen to perceive the value of music in wartime and to interest himself in its improvement. As I sat there, the memory of the hollow-cheeked bandmaster Tyler, who had stood next to me at the 4th of July parade in Paris, suddenly came back. I thought to myself that here I was, the only civilian at the table, and that therefore I might say anything I pleased without being put up against a wall at sunrise and shot, for at the worst they could only consider me as very ignorant of army customs. Therefore I watched for my opportunity, and suddenly plunged in, and spoke of my conversation with Bandmaster Tyler while we were waiting for our Marines to march down the Champs-Élysées. I said that in my humble opinion it was a great mistake to use musicians as stretcher-bearers in battle, not that their lives as soldiers were any more valuable than those of any others in the army, but that a stretcher-bearer could be trained in a very short time, while it took many months to train a bandsman, that the Canadian regiments had followed the same custom during the first months of the war, but the results had been so dire in destroying the bands and their usefulness that the soldiers themselves had implored their commanding officers not to let their bandsmen be sacrificed in this way, as there was nothing so terrible as coming back after battle to a silent and therefore desolate camp. After I had finished my rather impassioned peroration, General Bundy and others heartily agreed with me, but General Pershing said nothing at all, and I felt that I had perhaps talked too much and mal à propos. But the following morning, as I was seated with Colonel Collins at General Headquarters, arranging the details of my examinations, he smilingly handed me an order from the Commander-in-Chief, which had just arrived, and which was to be sent to the division commanders, to the effect that from now on bandsmen are not to be used any longer as stretcher-bearers, except in cases of extreme military urgency. One of General Pershing's remarks during the dinner is so characteristic that I repeat it here. He said, "When peace is declared and our bands march up Fifth Avenue, I should like them to play so well that it will be another proof of the advantage of military training." Subsequent developments and meetings with this interesting man further deepened the impression which he made upon me. I returned to Paris and proceeded to make all necessary arrangements for the examinations of the 200 bandmasters. Our army had leased a large hotel near the Bastille on the banks of the Seine, and a large room on the ground floor served admirably for my purpose. The band of the 329th Infantry soon arrived and was quartered in this hotel, and every morning at 9:30 the examinations began, and continued from Monday to Thursday at the rate of about 50 bandmasters a week, who arrived from all quarters of France, from the seaport towns, from the training camps, and some even from the very front line of the trenches. Fridays I would usually return to headquarters and report on my findings and begin recommendations, which gradually assumed greater and greater proportions as the magnitude of the work developed. To assist me in this prodigious work, I engaged the services of Monsieur Francis Casadisou, brother of Henri, and a splendid musician. He examined the men as to their qualifications in instrumentation and in their general knowledge of the various instruments, while I examined them in the actual process of conducting and drilling a band. I would first let them bite their teeth into an overture like the Oberon of Weber, or a movement from a classical symphony, and then would let them conduct a composition of their own choice. I found very soon that while most of these young bandmasters were musically talented and ambitious, they had had no or but little opportunity for acquiring what we may call the technique of the baton. They had had no intensive disciplinary training, such as our young officers from civilian life had received at Plattsburgh and similar camps. Many of them did not know how to beat time properly, much less train a band in phrasing or rhythmic accuracy, and I soon saw that unless some opportunity was given them to learn at least the rudiments of their calling, the effort toward improving our bands would be useless. It therefore seemed to me that the quick formation of a bandmaster's school was the only solution of the problem, and as our army had had the help of French military and aviation officers as instructors, loaned to us by the Ministère de la Guerre, I thought that a similar arrangement could be made, under which we might obtain the necessary musical instructors also from the French army, as nearly all the musicians of France were at that time in uniform. I also discovered that some of the most important musical instruments, which give mellowness and nobility to the tone of a band, were almost utterly lacking. We had hardly any oboes, bassoons, French horns, or flugelhorns. I knew that some of the greatest masters of these instruments, first prizes of the Conservatoire of Paris, were serving in the French army, and immediately, through the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, obtained their names and the regiments to which they belonged. On the following visit to Chaumont, I proposed to General Pershing that we form a music school at which 50 bandmasters could get the most intensive musical training and discipline for 8 weeks, to be succeeded by a new batch of 50, etc., and at the same time 40 pupils, each in oboe, bassoon, French horn, and flugelhorn, could get a similar training of 12 weeks on their respective instruments. General Pershing and his staff were delighted with the plan, and I offered to procure the necessary instructors from the French army, promising General Pershing that the school would be in complete running order by October 1st, provided a proper building could be obtained. The general asked me where I wished to place the school, and offered me Langres, where several schools on the strategy of war were already in progress, but I claimed that the surroundings for my music school should be of a more peaceful and even academic character, and suggested Chaumont. General Pershing smiled, but insisted that it was already overcrowded, and that I would not be able to find a building large enough to house so great a number of instructors and pupils. He gave me full power, however, to see what could be done, and I set forth immediately with a French liaison officer, member of the French Military Commission at Chaumont, and in G5 General Headquarters, under which department the proposed music school would come, who proved a most remarkable and valuable assistant in my work. He was Lieutenant Michel Weil, nephew of the owner of the well-known White House in San Francisco, and an enthusiastic musical amateur who, through his long residence in America, had acquired a knowledge of English and a sympathy for America only second to that for his own native land. He belonged to a delightful French officers' mess at Chaumont, and they immediately made me a kind of honorary member, and in most hospitable fashion invited me to their Lucullan repasts. As they were all enthusiastic lovers of music, I endeavored to repay them by pounding out Wagner, their supreme favorite, to their heart's content on an old upright piano placed in a little sitting room next to their salle à manger. Lieutenant Weil and I first paid a visite de cérémonie to the mayor of Chaumont and explained to him our desire. The idea of what he called un petit conservatoire de musique pour les Américains in Chaumont appealed to his fancy immensely, and he immediately picked up his telephone and called up an old friend of his, a fellow citizen and mill owner. He explained to him the great honor that was about to befall their town, if a proper building could be found, and exhorted him to show himself as a really patriotic citizen of France and friend of the Americans by giving the mill, which he owned just outside the city, and only a few minutes' walk from our headquarters, for this noble purpose. We motored to this building and met there an elderly, dignified, and courteous Frenchman, who told us that anything he had was at the disposal of les Américains. We found a huge mill with walls 2 feet thick, the machinery in disuse, and with large empty spaces that our army engineers could easily turn into sleeping quarters, practicing rooms, and other needs for a music school. In one large wing we found a few women and many children playing about. I said, "Of course, we shall need this wing also." "Then I regret," answered the owner, "but this wing you cannot have, because I have given it to 48 refugees from Verdun, with the promise that they shall occupy it until the end of the war." Naturally, Lieutenant Weil and I reconsidered, and concluded that a large tent could be put up in the meadow as an eating place, and that we could get along without the extra wing. I then asked the owner what rental he would demand. "Oh," he said, "anything that the American army wishes to pay." But when Lieutenant Weil informed him that he should fix a fair price, he asked timidly, "Would the American army consider 500 francs a month reasonable?" I tell this to offset the tales of those people who keep harping on the commercial greed of the French in anything that concerns the needs of the American soldier. We returned to General Headquarters jubilant, and, after a satisfactory interview with the officer in charge of building operations, it was decided to place the school in Chaumont, and I returned to Paris to complete my plans. My brother Frank had recognized the lack of good schooling for our Army bands and bandmasters many years before the war, and had very patriotically placed the entire machinery of his Institute of Musical Art at the disposal of the Secretary of War. An arrangement had accordingly been made by which a bandmaster's school at Governor's Island, New York, was placed under my brother's control, and for several years before the war a small number of bandmasters were graduated from it who ranked well on a par with those of other countries. But when we entered the war and our army was organized on a scale of millions, these were but a drop in the bucket, and heroic measures were necessary to bring some semblance of order into this musical chaos of hundreds of uneducated bandmasters and thousands of still less educated bandsmen. End of section 19.